Hi again, everybody. It's Nancy again, in the process of building my small sailboat, the Eastport Netting Pram. Today, instead of the usual watch me build the boat video, I'm going to tell you my top 10 beginning tips, or as you might call them, things I wish I'd known before I got started. By the way, you can watch my previous videos in this series to get a more visual sense of the things I'm going to talk about today. But here we go with the top 10. Tip number 1. Solve the boat part puzzle. Tip number 1 is for those using the boat kit as opposed to fabricating the boat parts yourself. Yes, the manual comes with a diagram of the parts you'll receive in the kit, but on some pieces, some of the details missing, so it's hard to know which actual piece is which. Here are the stumpers for me. Which of these seat supports is forward, middle, or aft? Well, the aft seat supports each have a big hole in them, so they're easy to tell apart. The forward and middle ones have two smaller, I don't know if you can see these tiny holes drilled into each of them. And the forward ones are cut at a sharper angle than the middle ones. What are these? They're not pictured in the manual. They're the center seat cleats. And to distinguish them from some other similar pieces, they're 13 1/8 inches long. This is the motor backing. It's not pictured in the manual. And there are two 9-inch pieces of wood, similar to the center seat cleats, that are two separators for the dagger board assembly. In the manual, it looks like one is slightly longer than the other, but I received two identical 9-inch pieces. Finally, what is this? It's a mystery piece. Chesapeake Light Craft couldn't tell me what it is and said it might have been put in my kit by mistake. If I find out otherwise and need it along the way, I'll be sure to let you guys know. On to tip number 2. Tip number 2 is to get the right clamps. I've mentioned this in another video, right here or here, but here's a review. When you buy them, some manufacturers label them with the dimensions that the clamps will open, and others label them with the length from the tip to the end of the handle. If the description tells you both, great, but I had a hard time figuring out which ones to buy and made at least one mistaken purchase. The clamps I found that worked I've linked to in the description below this video. Tip number 3, know your nibs. The boat kit manual mentions that you should remove some machine tabs on some of the wood pieces that are left over from the use of the cutting machine at the factory. I call them nibs. The manual even cautions you to not remove some other similar protrusions on the wood called tenons that are slightly bigger, but they need to be left there. But it's hard to tell them apart. The nibs to remove are these, but not these. Tip number 4, choose your sides wisely. Some of the faces of some of the boat parts will be visible to you when you finish the boat. On the other hand, some are interior faces that won't show. When you choose how to glue the parts together, check to see that the faces that will show on the boat's exterior are the pretty ones that show the most attractive wood grain. Of course, it's not tragic if you forget to do this, as there's no really ugly wood, but it's nice to have. Tip number 5, wet epoxy is a sticky mess. You want to avoid getting it anywhere it's not supposed to be. To help you with this, here's my tip. Have all the supplies that you will need laid out and ideally within easy reach when you start mixing the epoxy. This includes brushes, wipe-off rags, spreaders, denatured alcohol, and I find it easiest to pour it into some kind of a shallow container with a lid rather than the hard to open can that it came from, and aluminum foil and extra nitrile gloves. I go over these supplies in another video that I'll link to here. Or was it here? Or there? There. Okay. Tip number 6 is also about epoxy.
I call it wipe and wipe again.
It's much more work to remove excess epoxy after it's cured. For that, you need to sand or grind it away. To avoid this as much as possible, wipe away the excess while it's still liquid with a clean cloth that's been dipped in denatured alcohol. Vinegar might also work. And to keep the cloth ready for you, prepare it before you start mixing the two parts of the epoxy and keep it wrapped up in a ball of aluminum foil to keep it from evaporating. Then when you're ready to wipe, just unwrap the foil and your cloth is right there and ready to wipe. Tip number 7, beware the bubbles. This is more about epoxy. You know, I might do a video just about epoxy when I've figured out more of it. But for now, just be aware that bubbles are not your friend. They'll look a little ugly on pieces that people will see on your finished boat. So, a few tips for minimizing bubbles or avoiding them. Number 1, make sure the room is warm enough. The reason is that the bubbles will tend to rise faster and pop if the epoxy is warmer before you apply it. The epoxy company, Maz Epoxy, recommends a room between 68 and 75 degrees. Number 2 about bubbles, stir to mix very slowly. The faster you stir, the more bubbles will form. Number 3, put down a thin sealant coat of epoxy first. Now this, mind you, is for pieces that, again, will be visible once you finish your boat. If people aren't going to see it, the bubbles don't have a big effect. But for those pieces that people will see, this thin sealant coat is a recommendation from the epoxy company. Your thicker coat of epoxy will go on top of the seal coat, and that seal coat will prevent additional bubbles from rising into the thicker coat. There are other recommendations available on the internet that I haven't tried yet, such as to warm the 2 epoxy parts in a water bath before you mix them. And again, this idea is because the warmer the epoxy parts are when you mix them, the less viscous it will be, and more quickly the bubbles can rise to the top. And finally, again on the internet, and I haven't tried this yet, after you lay down the epoxy coat, use a heat gun or a gas torch to apply heat a few inches above the epoxy layer. Again, I haven't tried this, and I really hope I don't have to. Meanwhile, if you have your own tips for avoiding bubbles, let us know that in the comments below. Tip number 8. Don't be a martyr. Use a few power tools. Yes, you can build this boat entirely by hand, but some of the sanding and rounding you'll have to do will be extremely tedious and could take an extremely long time. I rounded the edges of the transoms and bulkheads by hand, and that was okay, but if I'd had the correct router and router bit, it could have taken minutes instead of a couple of hours. And if you have excess epoxy that is hardened that you need to remove, I would definitely recommend an electric sander and this mini Dremel tool, depending on the situation. Tip number 9, floor wax, anyone? Tip number 9 might not be an issue for you. It is about the paste floor wax that the manual says to use to coat the screws for the assembly of the boat halves. Maybe you have hardwood floors and have some of this in your closet already, but I didn't, and when I looked for some, I looked online, I could barely find any. Instead, there's finishing wax for furniture, and this comes in 1-pound cans. Well, I certainly didn't need that much to coat 6 screws. So instead, I bought this Butcher Block conditioner, which is pretty much made of the same kind of stuff. And it was a little less expensive and less quantity. And the kind folks at Chesapeake Light Craft said this would be fine. Finally, tip number 10. Remind yourself, it's an adventure. Well, with tips 1 through 9, you can see some of the challenges I encountered and some of the things I've learned. If you have similar experiences, you might get a little frustrated. So, as I keep having to tell myself, part of the fun is the adventure of learning all these new things. I hope this video will make it easier for you, and you might come up with your own gotchas and tips along the way. If you do, let the rest of us know about them in the comments below. Thanks, and see you next time!